This is James Fox with another video tutorial for QuickBooks Pro 2013. In this tutorial, we are going to learn how to memorize an invoice. Now, the reason why you will want to memorize an invoice is because if you have a recurring invoice to the same customer and it's for the same items and price every time, then it would be more efficient for you to memorize the invoice instead of creating the invoice every time that order needs to be filled. For example, if your company charges rent every month, then it's best to memorize the invoice and create the invoice from the memorized transaction list instead of creating the invoice manually every time. Another example is if your company charges a regular monthly maintenance fee, then once again it's best to memorize that invoice and create it from the memorized transaction list. So let's get started with memorizing an invoice. Now I have an invoice here to Mo Company. And my fictional company, Joe's Landscaping, sells 5 pink roses to Mo Company every single month. So instead of creating the invoice every month, I'm going to memorize this invoice so that it'll automatically be created every single month. So the first thing you need to do is create your invoice. And after you create the invoice, click Save on the ribbon just above the invoice. After you click Save, click the Edit menu, then select Memorize Invoice. Now when you see the Memorize Transaction dialog box, the first thing you should do is create a name for the invoice. And since Joe's Landscaping is selling 5 pink roses to Mo Company every month, I'm going to give it the name of Mo-Pink Roses. Now you have 3 options. The first option is to add to my reminders list. The second one is Do Not Remind Me. And the third one is Automate Transaction Entry. Now I'm going to select the easiest one first, which is Do Not Remind Me. If you select Do Not Remind Me, this transaction will be placed in your memorized transaction list, but you will not receive any type of notification as to when to create this invoice again, and I'll show you what that means. So select Do Not Remind Me and then click OK. Now to view this memorized transaction, click the Lists menu, then select Memorized Transaction List. Now here's the invoice that I just memorized. And if you look over here in the frequency column, you'll see the word never. That means you will never receive a reminder as to when to create this invoice. You should only select this option if you have a good memory and you know exactly when this invoice needs to be created. Now if you do select the Do Not Remind Me option, all you have to do is simply go to the Memorized Transaction List, which is what you see right here, and just double click on the invoice that you want to create, and an invoice will automatically be created. Okay, now I'm back at my original invoice and we're going to choose the next option. The next option is going to be Add to My Reminders List. If you choose this option, what's going to happen is this transaction will be placed in your reminders list on an interval that you specify here in the How Often field. Let's choose Add to My Reminders List. And how often do you want it to be added to your reminders list? I'm going to choose monthly. And the next date that I want it to be added to my reminders list will be June 1st, 2013. So on June 1st, 2013, this transaction will be added to my reminders list, and I'll have to go to my reminders list to view this transaction. Now keep in mind, you don't have to select monthly. It just depends on how often you want to create this invoice. If you're creating it every week or every day, then select those options. But for now, I'm going to choose monthly. I've chosen my next date as to when I want it to appear in my reminders list, and I'm going to select OK. Now to view your reminders list, click on the Company menu, then go down to Reminders. Now here is my reminders list, and if you take a look here, you'll see Memorized Transactions Due. If you double click that, here is the invoice that's due. So if you double click that invoice, it'll bring you to the Memorized Transaction List, and you can double click the invoice that needs to be created, and it will automatically create that invoice. Okay, now the third option that you can choose is Automate Transaction Entry. In my opinion, this is the best option to use because on the date that the invoice is due, when you open QuickBooks, you're going to receive a notification that this invoice should be created. So let's take a look at how to set this transaction up. The first thing you're going to do is select how often do you want this invoice to be created. And in this example, I'm going to select monthly. Now choose the next date for which you want the invoice to be created. I'm going to select June 1st, 2013. Now the next option is number remaining. That basically means how many more times do you want to create this invoice. I'm just going to select a random number of 5, which means that I'm going to create this invoice 5 more times. The next field is the days in advance to enter. What that means is how many days before the next date do you want this invoice to be created. For example, my next date is June 1st, 2013. If I type in the number 2, then this invoice will be created on May 30th, 2013. So it just means how many days before the next date do you want to enter this invoice. So enter that amount in and then click OK. Now I'm going to close out QuickBooks. Now when I open QuickBooks, there's going to be an automatic reminder that the invoice needs to be created. Now here's the Enter Memorized Transactions dialog box. Now you will only see this box on the next date that you entered previously. Here is the next date that I chose. Once that date arrives, that is when you're going to see this dialog box. Now you can selectively choose which invoices you want to be entered by placing or removing a check mark in the Select All column here. Once you have chosen your invoices to be entered, click Enter Checked Now, and QuickBooks will inform you how many transactions has been entered. Click OK, and here is the invoice that was automatically created, and here's the date that I chose previously. I strongly suggest that you use this option if you do have recurring invoices. If you have any questions, please email me. Once again, my name is James Fox, and I'll see you next time.